APrIGF. I'm terribly sorry that I'm not able to be with you in person, but it's 4:20 in the morning right now, so I'm going to do my absolute best to make sense and remain coherent at this hour. I'm glad I'm at least able to join you online, but really I wanted to thank Chat for stepping in and really helping us do this session, given that I wasn't able to make it. Chat, if you could please go to the first slide. I just wanted to quickly note that this conversation is really not meant to be sort of unidirectional. It's for us to be able to foster this conversation within the room and to be able to see how we can have this conversation with the larger APrIGF community and the broader actors within the region. So please, the participants online, if you feel like if there's any point, if you're able to jump in, please do. You can leave your comments online and I'll try and address them. Now, stakeholder engagement is such a critical part of the cycle of corporate accountability or even a cycle of corporate awareness, I would say. Broadly, I feel that stakeholder engagement, which is a process through which companies engage with different stakeholders, be it employees, be it people within different structures in the management or the workforce, engaging with their own suppliers or the people that they provide their products and services to, people who are impacted directly or indirectly by this, gender groups and groups that have expertise on that, and civil society. This is the process of stakeholder engagement. And a big part of that is also government representatives, technical community, all of these, right? It of course varies from scenario to scenario, but it's really important to have that kind of broad stakeholder engagement. What is the stakeholder engagement towards? Stakeholder engagement is really towards a broader process of human rights and environmental due diligence usually, which is a process through which companies are able to demonstrate that they know and show the human rights impact that they have, right? Because the private sector is such an integral part of the digital ecosystem. Driving innovation has been how we've been able to really kind of harness the power of ICTs. But it's an unmissable truth that in addition to all the positive impacts that tech companies have in our ability to enjoy human rights, there are several concerns about the negative impact that companies either directly cause, contribute to, or in some way linked to, especially in the global south and the region we operate out of. So stakeholder engagement essentially enables a process through which the wider communities are able to forewarn companies about actual or potential harms or impacts of their products, services, operations, or even simply the landscape within which a company exists. As much as it's a beneficial process for civil society, for communities to be able to engage with companies, it's also a truly valuable process for companies to get an understanding, which they otherwise would have had to rely on others to provide for them. This is a first, account of the impacts and possible impacts that companies can have. So it's a really critical process in that sense. The second key aspect of it is that it builds trust between companies and governments, between companies and different communities with civil society, their users, to be able to garner the social license for companies to operate. But I would say that, again, going back to the point that I was making earlier about forewarning, it really helps prevent a harm before it happens. And by preventing the harm before it happens, I'm not only talking about business harm, which is, legal, financial, reputational risks for companies as a result of human rights violations. it also helps prevent harms to the communities themselves. So we're not left in a situation where we feel like, well, we could not have foreseen this kind of negative repercussions of a particular piece of technology or how it's used. And when we're talking about tech companies, as you know, of course, they're not a monolithic entity. There are different kinds of tech companies, and these companies operate differently, and their uptake and demonstration of human rights commitments are also accordingly different, right? Chat, could you please help me move to the next slide? Perfect. Thank you. What we did, sorry, there's a slide in between that's missing. Can you check if maybe there's a slide before this? No? Okay. What I'll do is let me share a link here. Maybe in your version. It's probably missing, but that's okay. Don't worry about it. I'm just sharing a link here. This is a link to a research that the Resource Center carried out with the support of several organizations, including APC. It's called Dismantling the Facade, a Global South Perspective on the State of Engagement with Tech Companies. And what we did was that over a period of about a year or so, we spoke to 40 different or more actors who are based in about 11 odd countries or more, really, in terms of their own experiences with stakeholder engagement. And the reason why we decided to do a Global South perspective is that over the course of those conversations, we realized that the Global North, or more particularly the US, Europe experience of digital defenders speaking to companies was vastly different from the kind of challenges that the Global South colleagues of ours were having in terms of being able to talk to companies, but also get the results that we are hoping for. What's very interesting is that the sharing that we had from Damar and my colleague from Taiwan confirms some of the challenges that we were able to capture over the course of the research. What we also did was try and showcase 3 examples or 3 case studies from the Global South of ways in which our communities are currently engaging and advocating for corporate accountability in the tech sector. Now, what are the challenges, right? In terms of the biggest challenge that was reported was the opaqueness of business practices. And this was also pointed out when we just had this conversation before this. It's been very difficult to get data from companies. What's available on their website isn't always very specific enough. The reports, very few companies put out human rights impact assessment or due diligence reports. Very few companies provide transparency reports. It's been very difficult to get data out of companies. And it's not only social media platforms, it's surveillance companies, all of these different companies that have different kinds of impacts on our rights. So given that their business practices, the decision-making around policies have been so opaque, it's also been very difficult for us to pinpoint where the problem is. We're able to pinpoint that a company's services are problematic or products are problematic, but because we don't have enough access to their data or information, it's been challenging. One of the core responsibilities of the Resource Center, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, has been reaching out to tech companies. So what we do is that on a daily basis, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center tracks about 10,000 odd companies that are split up across different sectors: garment, tea, food and beverages, to name a few, right? And one of the sectors that we closely follow is also the tech sector. What we essentially do is that we sift through information online from civil society and media about human rights violation-related allegations that are made against companies. When companies have not made a public response to an allegation, we write to them asking them to respond and provide a response. We make their response and non-response public. What we've noticed is that the tech sector has an interestingly lower rate of response than, say, when you compare it to the apparel sector. The rate of response of the tech sector to our questions or allegation letters is more or less on par with oil and gas companies or natural resources extraction related companies, right? Now, that sector, natural resources, is infamous for being really, really opaque. At the moment, our data reflects that the tech companies, the technology sector is more or less on par with that. They're definitely not nearly as responsive as the agriculture sector or the garment sector, which are, some of the more responsive sectors in terms of responding to allegations from civil society. So that is, I think, an interesting data point that demonstrates that the sector as such remains quite opaque. Now, coming to another big challenge, which Damar pointed out, is inaccessible company structures. In most cases, our colleagues are left with only access to the public policy team, which often lacks the decision-making abilities, as was pointed out, nor are they able to fully explain or take back the solutions that we are looking for, right? In a lot of cases, if you think about it, it's the marketing team that might be problematic, or it could have been the design team that has the solution or has a better understanding of the problem. But the thing is, we don't have access to them. And oftentimes, we don't have access to anybody beyond the public policy team, which means that it's very unlikely that we're able to talk to the CEO or the COO. Very rarely we'd be able to reach at that point, right? And this also means that we don't have a very clear understanding of the board of these companies. And then ultimately, we're also not then able to reach out to different pressure points for a company, like, for example, investors. Now, that points to another challenge that's more internal. Limited capacity was pointed out repeatedly as one of the big challenges why the digital rights community is not able to push as strongly on corporate accountability in the tech sector, which is because our resources are so thin that monitoring and doing advocacy, for example, with governments, already takes up so much time that we don't necessarily have the expertise to be able to understand or showcase how a company works or how a particular company works, because those require access to specialized databases in a lot of cases, and also sort of different spaces in terms of business and human rights, which we don't always have access to. Another interesting challenge that was pointed out, but this time more related to the internal workings of a company, is that there's often lack of whistleblower protection, which means that people working within companies are often the only source we have to expose company practices. But when they do so, they face significant legal, financial, emotional, even in some cases, physical harm, right? And there's really no protection for them. Oftentimes, most tech employees, especially in big tech, are forced to sign non-disclosure agreements, which prevents them from being able to disclose information which is critical for our understanding of how human rights are impacted. The last basket of challenge that was pointed out was discriminatory practices, which goes back to why we decided to focus on the global south, is that there is definitely undertones of racism in terms of who gets access to whom in terms of tech companies. Our US and Eurocentric colleagues are definitely in a much better position. Well, one could argue that it could be because these companies are domiciled there, right? But that's not always the case. Even when these companies have local offices, it's very difficult for us to get access to decision-making bodies within these companies. Information is probably more openly shared with Global North groups than Global South groups, even for research purposes. So all of these kind of set out some of the key challenges. Chat, could you please help go to the next slide?
Gaya, few more minutes, yeah?
Yes. Yes. And broadly, what we've noticed as strategies is that companies have been, is that civil society has been using different ways, right? It could be by talking to companies, participating in the human rights and environmental due diligence work. It could be through doing rankings, which has become very important. In fact, one of our colleagues, Derechos Digitales in Chile, they put out consistent ranking on privacy practices of companies. And then we've seen a very important role of campaigning, of maintaining evidence, as our colleagues in Myanmar have been able to demonstrate how close ties with the media, using the UN, all of these different platforms, sometimes leads to positive results. Another really important strategy that we've been following is essentially what we're doing right now, which is inviting tech companies to be a part of meetings that we are involved in, or we are hosting in another case, it was what we host, but these sort of multi-stakeholder processes. But all of the other traditional methods of going to court, advocating for better laws, participating in human rights and environmental due diligence, doing research, exposing practices, we've been doing all of these as broad strategies. In some cases, they've resulted in positive impacts. In some cases, there haven't really been any major responses. Let me go to the last part of my presentation. Chat, could you please go to the next slide? Yes. So to help us with our push for corporate accountability, there are different sort of mechanisms, tools that we've had, right? One of the tools that I'm personally involved with is the tech company dashboard that the Resource Center maintains. And let me quickly give you the link to that here, because what we do with the tech company dashboard is that we consistently track about 81 tech companies at the moment. So you'll be able to get access to information about the broad company structure, etc. And then there are rankings such as ranking digital rights, or the one that I mentioned by Derechos Digitales, but there are also other broad multi-sector rankings, CBHR rankings that you can take a look at. The company's websites are a really important resource, and then the reports that they put out are also extremely important, including the environmental and human rights due diligence reports. At the moment, the key source of understanding the human rights problems posed by companies has been civil society reports and media reporting. Let me pause there, because the next part is really about recommendations, but I would like to come back to that towards the end. Back to you, Chat. I'm sorry if I overshot.
No, that's fine. Thank you. Thank you very much, Gaya. I think you've given us a really good overview of what the research you've done. So for the next 20 minutes, what I would like us to do is, one, if you have questions for Gaya, but also if you have, does any of this resonate with you, the experiences or any challenges that were shared? This is in your experience. Do you think there's anything that's missing from what Gaya was sharing that we need to, take into account? And have you had any success, if any, like, happy experiences with this engagement will be also a good thing to talk about. Any successful strategies? So these are some of the questions that I'd like to pose to you. And I'll come to the floor because will save us time. So yeah, and any questions you have for Gaya. She says 81. I was going to ask you, Gaya, how many companies, and she was saying 81 companies they're monitoring, but there are many more companies, I suppose, that we can monitor. So anyone want to start? Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Gaya. Thank you, Chet. My name is Deborah. I'm from Indonesia, Tifa Foundation. So this session was actually related to the previous session in this room as well, around content moderation and platform accountability. So my question would be related to my observation that the focus when we talk about corporate accountability, platform accountability, we often talk about the big techs, but national and local ISPs and telcos are also part of the problem. And even though they're has been a lot of transnational efforts and national efforts to push for the accountability of big tech, but local and national ISPs, they are really compelled to follow the national laws of the country. So my question would be, what would be the strategy or maybe successful experience of engaging with these national ISPs in countering notice and takedown and notice and shutdown orders from the government, for example? And I am aware that there has been a research done by ranking digital rights with a civil society organization in Indonesia in ranking telcos in terms of their adherence to the guidelines of business and human rights. But I think even though the research is there, data is there, the question would be, how do we use this data to actually advocate for more transparency and accountability, and also more engagement from the ISPs with the civil society? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me quickly respond to that chat. I think it's a really, really critical point to note that it's not only the big tech companies that we need to be following, right? In fact, that's how my program works, is that I'm personally not as invested in I mean, not that it's not important. Big tech companies have big impacts, no doubt. But I feel that the medium and smaller companies are actually, and national companies are probably more important to me personally, because they are the evolving ones, right? So then you have a greater chance of helping inform their ethics, their values, and how they are going to be as a business. So what we did, just as an explanation, is that initially we picked 40 big companies. This was 2 years back. Over the last year and a half, we've added 41 companies, which are more sort of the next 41 in a sense, emerging companies. That was a conscious decision. And this year, we're adding 15 African-based companies to this list of 81. So we'll have 96. So we are hoping that going forward the next year, especially the first quarter of next year, I would really love to add Asia-based companies. And if anybody would like to inform or help inform which companies it is that need to go into that list, I'll be more than happy to do that. Then we can consistently track the performance of those companies. In terms of the question around ISPs and the responsibility to follow national law, I think really sort of the international standard at the moment on corporate accountability is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And what the Guiding Principles tells us is that companies cannot simply just say that we have to follow the national law. They are under an obligation to do everything they can to follow the international standard. This is a piece of research we put out more specifically on internet shutdowns and what it is that we expect from tech companies and ISPs. What you would be very interested to know is that we sent out a survey. This is Africa, of course, focused, this report. We sent a survey, and I think it was to 22 companies, but I could be wrong about the exact figure of companies that we sent it to. None of them wrote back to tell us that they had human rights policies, which means that most ISPs don't necessarily have a very significant human rights policy that they base their decisions on to start with. And we've put out our expectations from ISPs and other tech companies when it comes to internet shutdowns. And I'm happy to see if you would like to take a look at that and replicate it for Asia. Yeah.
Thank you, Gaia. So anybody else wants to? Yes.
Hello, Brent Carey for the record. I just had a question. I'm the chair of New Zealand's online safety code of practice for online harms. And in that code of practice, we have a human rights-based approach. And I was wondering, given how many codes of practice are being written currently around the world, whether you've got any views or any research that you can point to on where you think codes of practice with a rights-based approach might be working or not, or if it might just be too early?
No, that's such an interesting question. And in fact, this came up in another meeting where I was discussing this exact topic about how there are, several parallel processes at the moment on different topics, whether it's with UNESCO, and then there is, different initiatives with GNI, and then you have the Christchurch initiative. There are multiple initiatives that are ongoing, trying to hold tech companies accountable. Now, in my personal view is that this is the cycle of evolution of corporate accountability in different sectors. If we look at the garment sector, for instance, we had the Rana Plaza Accord. We had multiple different accords over a period of time. Some of these processes will survive. Some of these processes will eventually fall off. But we just have to attempt it. But to your question of what's the analysis, I think it's actually a really good research question, and it's come up already multiple times. So thank you for flagging it. Perhaps it's something I'll do a little bit of writing with my team on next year, possibly early next year. But it's definitely something that we need to understand more. What are the multi-stakeholder initiatives at the moment? What's working? In what spaces are tech companies being more responsive? But yeah, thank you for asking that.
Thanks. More? Any other experience questions here?
Hi, I'm Rafi Copeland from Internews here. I just wanted to say, first of all, thanks for the great session, really important topic. Similar to Damar, Internews, we're part of a number of different trusted flagger programs. We've worked, we've pursued a policy of engagement with the big tech companies, worked very closely, particularly with Meta. We recently published a report on Meta's trusted flagger program, where we spoke to trusted partners all around the world, including a number of partners in the Asia Pacific region. What we found was that there was huge frustration with that program in terms of the response times. It would often take weeks and often months to get a response. I think the record we had one was 8 months for a report around incitement to violence, which is obviously too long. And there were a lot of real feelings that despite the level of engagement, even when partners were invited to consultations and things like that, that they were just not being listened to. And then the companies would say that they'd done the engagement, and actually publicly, when they were criticised, say, "Oh, we're working with our trusted partners or our local partners," and then the partners would be saying, "Hang on, but we told them not to do that thing that they did." There's a really strong feeling that people were being gaslit. So my question, I do have a question. My question is around beyond kind of principles or codes of practice, whether there's a role for kind of regulation or specific best practices when it comes to the kind of details of how these engagements happen. And I know that there's trusted flaggers are mentioned in the DSA, for example. There's some guidance around there, but that seems to be focusing actually on the trusted partners themselves and worrying that maybe they have too much power, rather than the role of the platforms in actually listening to those. So yeah, wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
No, that's an excellent question, because really, if we think about it, as such, in the Asia Pacific region, when it comes to labor laws, when it comes to corporate accountability or using consumer protection laws, there's varying degrees of what's effective, what's not. In some countries, you have a better regimes in terms of better regime in the sense regime for corporate accountability, and in some cases we don't. And then there is weaknesses related to courts. But there is inescapably a big gap in terms of coherent policy making when it comes to tech companies. There is sort of a knee-jerk reaction. Every time there's a problem, then you have a law addressing a particular problem rather than addressing the broader question of what is expected from tech companies. I don't think that, for example, there are strong enough national action plans from the UN guiding principles on business and human rights currently within Asia. It's not Asia Pacific region. It's not a very even space to start with. I would say really in terms of the key piece of legislation that we need to focus on and perhaps really push for is something on the lines of what Europe is currently considering, which is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, where the EU has made it clear that they are expecting companies to conduct human rights and environmental due diligence. Now, in Asia, we do have some examples. For example, for instance, Japan is currently, they came out with the policy guidelines requiring companies. In fact, it's one of the very few countries that had human rights and environmental due diligence policy that refer to technology companies in some way, shape, or form. I think it's really important that that's the first step, is that once we get companies to routinely and periodically do human rights and environmental due diligence, they will have to demonstrate that A, they spoke to different communities, B, that they understand and know what their harms that they're likely to cause. So I think that's where I would start. But definitely in the research also, we talked about, we've looked at instances where companies have been held liable before courts, before OECD, for instance, or at least attempted to be held liable. We haven't explored that enough. In the last section about recommendations, we'll go back to that about how to leverage strategic litigation, perhaps, to hold companies materially liable for what they have done or not done.
Thanks, Gaya. Gaya, how do you make what does it take to convince a government to do a national? I suppose, but the question here is, how do you make companies do that? Does the state have a role in making that happen? Sorry, yeah. Sorry to take the mic and ask the question, but I just wanted to follow that up.
That's a great question. Are you asking about human rights and environmental due diligence?
Yeah, no, I think you were saying that companies, that's the first step that companies need to do, is to do this plan. So is there a state responsibility there? Or is it just companies saying, yes, we're going to do this? I think that's my question.
You know what's interesting, Chat, is that because human rights and environmental due diligence, HRDD, I'm going to call it that for now that we established it, has become sort of, especially for transnational companies, several countries are now requiring companies to do that. So those that are domiciled in Europe are starting to do it anyway, slowly. But it's really the state's responsibility to say, look, if you want to operate in my country, if you want to make money out of your operations in my country, you've got to do human rights and environmental due diligence just as much as you do financial due diligence, just as much as you do labor due diligence, right? One other very interesting point, Chat, is that one of the pressure points is investors, because investors are also becoming now jittery about their investments and then getting caught up in legal battles, reputational battles. So investors are also asking companies to do human rights and environmental due diligence. So that's another avenue to pressure, is states, investors, and companies. We've got to target them differently, but really states are best positioned to make companies do this.
Okay, thank you. So we have about 5-10 more minutes. Any other question or experience you want to share from the floor here? Yes.
Thanks so much for your presentation, and the discussion's really interesting. My name is Sam. I'm just curious, I've done a little bit of work in, I guess, activism related to the extractive industries, and they are incredibly opaque. Their basic strategy is not to engage. Now, tech companies from a PR perspective do engage, but I'm just wondering, is it public relations? I mean, we know that, it's the assumption that we're making that tech companies want to do the right thing, the correct starting point.
Okay, so I mean, if I use a purely activist hat, of course, that's what I'm tempted to say, is that, look, all of this is just PR, and it's true. In some cases, it is true, because you get frustrated with the responses. But the thing is, I do see several instances where tech companies have really tried to understand the problems of their practices and address them as well. So there are positive examples too. But what I would say is that, and perhaps Chad, this links to how do we move forward from here, right? I think the biggest thing is we have to overcome this trust deficit where there's definitely a perception, even if we don't want to say reality, that there is not enough genuine engagement, and there's not, it becomes unidirectional. And that trust deficit and lack of social license to operate is something that tech companies have to resolve. They do have to resolve, because even from a business perspective, the fact simply remains that the companies that last are companies that are companies, that are value-based companies, that are companies that truly are respected by their stakeholders, right? The buyers, their consumers, their employees. To get that kind of respect, you do need to be able to overcome this trust deficit that's there at the moment, even from a pure financial perspective. So with that in mind, I would say that when we did the research, it was very quite clear that the major recommendations were around 4 factors. And maybe if someone can pull up the second last slide, but it's really just, very quickly I could point it out. But if you can't, it's totally fine as well. I think the major sort of recommendation that came up is that we need to do evidence building. For instance, my colleague just mentioned that extractive experience in the extractive industry, right? Now, what is interesting is that when it comes to extractive industry, tobacco, oil, gas, there is a history of consistent evidence building where groups are focused on consistently recording the activities and the impacts of these companies. We are, of course, doing it as well, but then my opinion is that it's a little bit sporadic and not always very consistent. So we need to consistently build evidence, and we need to look at other movements and look at how anti-tobacco activists went about it, or how other corporate accountability activists went about their evidence collection, and try to replicate some of it. And we do need to build a capacity, then reach out to other movements to try and see how we can build a capacity around different strategies, right? One of the interesting things is that there's unlike other sectors in the tech sector, there's not a sufficient link between tech workers and digital rights groups for many reasons, right? Like I said, there's lack of whistleblower protection. There's also mistrust because, obviously these are people who contributed to the problem itself and are not always just victims, But we need to build that capacity to reach across and also speak to the different workers in tech companies. There's certainly a sense that there's lack of coordination. There's not enough coordinated campaign or coordinated research or coordinated advocacy efforts, which includes even speaking to companies, because sometimes what happens is there are 7 parallel conversations that are happening with companies and civil society, and in many cases, civil society is not in a position to coordinate among ourselves when we are talking to the company so we can follow up. And the last issue has really been resourcing, chat, because, on top of the existing challenges we have with our resources not being enough to do the existing workload, it is an additional layer of work. But I think that especially for the Asia Pacific region, where sometimes we have real challenges with getting governments to act or act quickly enough, it's really important that companies and civil society are able to build a positive relationship where companies are able to more willingly respond to our concerns. But these are sort of just broad recommendations. I would love to hear if anybody else has observations on what really needs to happen now to strengthen our corporate accountability movement.
That's a good segue question to the floor to see, okay, are there any, from what you've heard, insights? Do you think there's anything that we can add to, even if this is just first steps? I think what I heard earlier is that in the region, there's not really there needs to be more research. There needs to be much more information. We need a hit list. No, I was thinking in my head, you wanted like more. No, I'm joking, okay? We need a list of companies that we want to monitor in the region, that we need to monitor in the region because they matter, right? They do. So maybe that's one thing to think of, to look at. So I'll start with that, but anything else that you are thinking about?
Brent, Carey. One thing I thought about was when you talked about trusted flagger. Trusted flagger means different things to different platforms. And the colleague that shared the example of the delay. So I wonder if there is something that we can do in relation to some consensus or commonality around some guiding principles in the trusted flagger program across platform, like timeliness of response, escalation of harm, like incitement to violence or incitement to suicide, way more harmful than perhaps an impersonation scam that you might have a bit more time. So I just wondered practically whether getting something around what a trusted program might mean. It may be already be done, but I just wondered if that was something to do.
Yes, please. Yes, anything else in addition that we can you can think of, especially in already related to the work that you're doing. Yeah.
Sorry, just another question about brand. Do the platforms care or worry about, do you think, brand matters? Because with apparel industries, I guess brand does matter. Or with the tech companies, does brand come into play?
Not for Elon Musk. Sorry, I couldn't resist that. Okay, go.
No, I think that the comment from Brent about trust programs, I think one of the, and now when I kind of link it to his earlier comment, I think one of the recommendations really for us to also work on should be trying to understand the different processes that are currently available for corporate accountability in the tech sector. What are the government-involved initiatives? What are the corporate-propelled initiatives like the Trusted Flaggers program? And try to see, and I think that's an excellent research point, and I'm really excited. I think I'll go back and relay that to my team and see. I think we need to do a little bit more analysis of how these different programs are working, and possibly governments might be in a good position to guide companies on the question of, a little bit more practicalities on how this needs to happen, privacy around it, and all of that. The question on brand goes back to the comment I was trying to make, is that when we look at traditional companies, so to speak, traditional companies, they've built their brands over decades, right? Most tech companies are possibly at most 30 years old, or 30 to 40 years old at most, right? So it's still sort of in a young stage. I would say that the brand consciousness is probably more with some of the older, bigger tech companies. For instance, I definitely see that there are companies such as HP, Microsoft, Ericsson. These are companies that are quite conscious about harm to their reputation, who have put in place at least publicly available quite clear human rights policies. So you can see that those companies are quite conscious about their brand and any negative associations that their brands might have. And we see that in the responses that they give us as well when we write them. They really make their position as a brand quite clear. But that's the point we need to drive home, is that tech companies need to build brands that would last, and then that's what investors should ideally be interested in. But the fact is, the tech sector is sort of at the moment still going through that quick revenue, quick turnover sort of model, which the coal industry, the railways industry, the tobacco industry went through in a different phase of its cycle. So it's also investors who are pushing quick returns as an issue, which of course ultimately will impact the brand value.
Thanks, Gaia.
But
okay,
Chat, yeah. I just wanted to make one quick one other quick observation, and I'll stop with that. I really do believe that companies have a very important role, positive role that they can play here. I think it'll be great to hear from companies what it is that they need help with, what it is that will be most helpful for them to hear from us, what data they need, in addition to what they should be gathering themselves. So I would also invite tech companies to help us understand how to improve stakeholder engagement with them.
Yeah, we have to get them in the room first. I know that's the thing. But I think yes, sorry. Yes, no, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Tad, I didn't mean to steal the mic. Hi, Guy. Hi, everyone. I'm Cheryl Cito from Meta, and listening with a lot of interest to all of the comments. And Brent, really appreciate your thoughts on some more, I think, robust conversations between the tech platforms and the trusted flaggers. So I think there are a lot of things that we could do to maybe come into a room together and talk about what you guys aren't getting from us, but also what we need to be able to better triage. There is a huge volume of stuff that does come up to us. And some of it, as Brent said, is not necessarily as time critical or going to lead to imminent real world harm. And so I think being able to talk together about how we can help you guys triage things so that we're getting as high quality reporting as possible that then can enable us to be as responsive to the right types of escalations. So for example, a flagger coming to us and saying, can you please look at this urgently because the person who's raised it is really angry. That doesn't necessarily mean that there is harm involved in that particular case. And so we need to then make a decision as to what we should and shouldn't be triaging and what we should and shouldn't be prioritizing. So I think there is a lot that we can do together to try and make these processes more efficient and more effective for everybody to ultimately lead to better experiences for people when they come online. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else? I think there was one other company. I don't want to put you in a spot, but is there anybody else? Yes.
Thanks. This is just a comment in terms of how we could maybe get people, the right people into the room to kind of discuss things, and then create that sort of sense that this is a common interest. In Australia, we have industry codes of practice, which are developed with community, government, it's registered with government. And as you all probably know, it sets out community standards in terms of content. And then there is a sort of an accountability element there too, in terms of, if you don't comply, there is a little bit of a stick somewhere along the line that could be wielded against you. So that's just a thought whether something like that could be kind of developed or massaged into kind of a practical outcome.
Look, we have 55 seconds, but we can have 5 more minutes. So I'll give the mic to you.
Look, I'm just being really cheeky here, but I just wanted to push back against the comment from Meta there about the volume of poor quality reporting being an issue. And I know that poor quality reporting is a huge issue, but according to the numbers provided by Meta, there's only 1,000 reports a month submitted through the Trusted Partner Program, which works out at 33 a day for the whole world. So, I don't think there's any reason why something can take months to get back. I don't think volume is the issue. And poor quality reporting is an issue, but I think that the only way to get better quality reporting is to engage further and, better with the partners themselves. So I just wanted to kind of push back. I couldn't help myself from doing that. Thanks.
But it's I think this is exactly what the conversation needs to happen. There are difficult issues here, obviously, right? And we're trying to build a space so that we can, in fact, talk about this, so we can move forward with the realization that there are difficult issues and really risks. There are people who are really at risk. And I think that's the kind of thing that we keep in mind, and we're trying to find solutions to it. So thank you for raising that, and thank you for listening to it. So with that, though, I think we will close. But thank you, everybody, for really sharing. And I think it's a good conversation. We've had a good conversation. I'll give you 1 minute to sort of tell us, Gaia, what you took from this and what you can give back and what people can expect I'm going to put you on the spot and then we can close. Thanks. Go ahead, Gaya.
No, thank you, Chad. Thank you so much. And I really appreciated the conversation in the room. And I'm definitely walking away with ideas of what it is that we need to focus on next and what we can make available. I've shared my email address and the last slide should have my email address, but please just text me if you'd like to have my email address. I'm happy to walk you through the tools because the report that I shared also has resources that you could use. I'm looking forward to more conversations with Meta, with other colleagues, so that we can exchange more information and see how, for instance, Meta's first human rights report, which is really a welcome move for the industry itself, can be replicated, how it can be strengthened going forward, how industry standards can be developed, how different multi-stakeholder initiatives and guidances can be improved. There's a lot we can do together. So please feel free to reach out. Whatever I can do, I'm happy to do, but I'm sure there's a lot that we can do together. Thank you so much for taking the time to spend this hour with us and really just please reach out if you need anything. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for coming and have a nice break.
Thank you, everyone. Please do remember to highlight the issues that you heard in this session or any questions you might have for Gaia in our platform. Comment.APrIGF.Asia. Join us at the town hall. Speak up, especially about the issues that we heard in this really good session. After the tea break coming up in the same room, we have an interesting session called Mines, Maps, and Minerals. Trace the complex material of your smartphone to make more sustainable choices. Please enjoy your tea.